Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Welcome back to the third season of Maritime Nation. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. While in uniform, I relied on Dataminr First Alert for situational awareness within the ever-expanding public available information space. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Anne Patterson. Ma'am, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Ambassador Patterson was the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern and North African Affairs at the Department of State from 2013 to 2017. Before being appointed to the Dow Jones Special Committee in April 2018, she served as ambassador to Egypt from 2011 to 2013, ambassador to Pakistan from 2007 to 2010, ambassador to Colombia from 2000 to 2003, and ambassador to El Salvador from 1997 to 2000. Ambassador Patterson recently retired with the rank of Career Ambassador after more than 4 decades in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Patterson also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, among other assignments. She is currently a Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale and a member of the Commission on National Defense Strategy. Anne Patterson was named one of Foreign Policy's 100 Top Global Thinkers in 2011. She is a 2-time recipient of the State Department's Distinguished Service Award, and she has been appointed to 2 congressional commissions, the Commission on National Defense Strategy in 2017 and the Syria Study Group in 2019. Ambassador Patterson, and if I may call you Anne, welcome to Maritime Nation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss this fascinating topic with you. So thank you for inviting me, Jim.
Thank you. I'm delighted. Now, before we dive in, and it's our tradition to kick off each episode of Maritime Nation with a featured term from the Naval Terms Dictionary, my plebe year edition from 1977 at the Naval Academy. And for this episode, I thought it would be special to pick the acronym MSG, which stands for Marine Security Guard. Believe it or not, there is an acronym in the book, MAA, for Master at Arms, and those are sailors who guard our ships and bases. But my 1977 edition did not have MSG. I'm going to talk about it anyway. A Marine Security Guard is a Marine who is part of a brigade-sized detachment assigned to provide security at American embassies, consulates, and other official U.S. government offices. The United States Marine Corps has a long history of cooperation with the Department of State, which administers the nation's diplomatic posts. Marines have served on special missions as couriers, guards for embassies and delegations, and security for U.S. citizens in the frontier. By the way, our sound engineer today, Ms. Jolene Edwards, is a former Marine, and she's proud of it. So, ma'am, as a 4-time U.S. ambassador, you've come across Marine security guards throughout your career. Can you share some thoughts on these young Marines that defend our embassies worldwide?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to share some thoughts because they're an integral part of our operations overseas and have been really for cooperating with the State Department for literally hundreds of years since the Barbary Pirates. But it was formalized right after World War II. And now Marine security guards protect 170 embassies and consulates. And let me say protect is perhaps legally not quite the correct word because they're supposed to guard classified material and the facilities, but protect they do as a practical matter. Let's not beat around the bush about that. And the participants, the Marines who are selected, are basically the cream of the crop because they have to have really good judgment. And if somebody, for instance, walks in from a foreign intelligence agency and says, I want to defect, the Marine security guard has to know what to do. Or I remember one case where...
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, sure, they have to know what to do,
Wow.
who to call. And it's not always obvious, or they get an American citizen who's mentally disturbed, for instance. They have to know how to handle that kind of situation. And this is on top of the obvious military skills that they must have for the job. So they're good.
Yeah.
And mostly the detachments are run by gunnery sergeants, and they're usually the top of the line too.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd recount a couple of incidents that, in my own experience, the Marriott Hotel in Pakistan was bombed in 2008, and 45 people were killed. And we were sitting in the Marine House the night that happened. And the Marines instantly mobilized, mostly to lend their medical services to people that had been injured there. And this incident was sort of a reflection of what had happened in 1979, when the American embassy had been overrun, and Sergeant Stephen Crowley, who was a Marine security guard, was killed. And we had a memorial to him on the embassy grounds. And the Marines in 1979, the government was frankly very late to protect the embassy. No one was entirely sure whether it was on purpose or because of incompetence. But the Marines managed at the end to lead the people who were trapped in the vault out of the embassy. But what happened was a miracle. It rained, and that extinguished the fire in the embassy.
Wow.
And it drove the demonstrators away. But it was really extreme bravery on behalf of the Marine Security Guard attachment. And of course, they play an important role in embassy morale. The Marine Ball is a big annual event, and just the support they give to the embassy community.
Well, it's ironic that you mentioned the Marriott in Pakistan, because we'll talk later about your time as ambassador to Pakistan and the many visits that Admiral Mullen made to visit you and Pakistani senior leadership. And I always went with him. And the first time we stayed in that Marriott, and it was about a week later that it was attacked by a truck bomb. And I remember seeing the video of the bombing. It was just horrific. I also remember the big fish tank as you walked in. It was full of grouper and colorful fish. And Admiral Lefevre told me after the bomb went off, the fire subsided, and Pakistani security let them go in because we had Americans there, and the deceased were still there. Yeah, and how terrible that was to walk into that building in that hotel, which was one of the nicer ones in town, and all in the sake of foolish terrorism.
A Navy petty officer, a very young Navy petty officer, was killed there too, Matthew O'Brien.
Wow.
He had been assigned to the embassy just a few weeks before. And there were 3 Americans killed that night because of the very fortunate event that turned out, because we had 45 people there. Most of our people were eating in a restaurant toward the back.
Oh, wow.
But it was.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. But a lot of remains were never even found.
Wow. Just horrific.
Yeah.
And of course, the reason why we were embroiled in the war on terror.
Exactly.
Well, Ambassador Patterson, I want to also bring up this book, a great book, which I know you have seen and downloaded. It's called Boots and Suits, edited by Ambassador Phil Cosnet, who is a friend of mine, a fellow member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. General Kenneth McKenzie, former CENTCOM, wrote the foreword. I was privileged to write the preface for this book. The book discusses aspects of military diplomacy, featuring an edited collection of chapters by ambassadors, scholars, and service members. A very diverse set of authors explain military diplomacy through the lens of both the military and the diplomatic corps, including perspectives from the United States and our allies. The Center for Maritime Strategy hosted a book launch of this book last year because we strongly believe in its focus on military diplomacy through the lens of both the military uniform wearers and the diplomatic corps. In this episode, we'll be talking about your career, ma'am, and highlighting your experiences in military diplomacy and some of the relationships you built over time with those of us in uniform. So let's dive in. First time you became ambassador was in El Salvador at a very difficult time after the end of a bloody civil war. So Duarte was in charge. You provided support for the recovery process. The war ended in 1992. You got there in 1997. There's still a heck of a lot of work to do in reconstruction. And the U.S. during the period of the Civil War was flowing billions of dollars of military aid into that country. And technically, it didn't taper off. It just kind of stopped at the signing of the peace treaty. And so here you come in 1997, you're having to rebuild trust between the Americans and the government and the people. And 75,000 people died, some due to death squads. It had to be a really, really challenging job for you as the first of 4 posts as ambassador. So my question is, were you able to leverage any assistance from U.S. military or attaches, assigned combatant commanders to help rebuild the country? Southcom would, of course, have been involved there. And can you share any experiences of your time on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. You know, the war in El Salvador was one of the last gasps and one of the bloodiest of the Cold War. Certainly in terms of population and disappearances. I met people who family members had walked out the door one day and never come back.
Wow.
They had no clue what happened to them. But the U.S. military, of course, had a lot of exposure to El Salvador during the war. And of course, that was not without controversy.
Right.
And certainly in the early days, the military, the Salvadoran military, there were accusations, many justified, of atrocities. But it got better as time went on. And I would ascribe a lot of this to U.S. military training. Huge numbers of people went through there. And the training was not only about human rights and international law, it was also to make them more professional. Because once you know what you're doing, you don't just shoot randomly into a crowd and things like that. And by the time I got there, there was a very strong relationship between the Salvadoran and the American military. And one of the things that we never think about anymore is how the military dominated governments in Latin America for years. In Chile and Argentina, 1 year in Bolivia, there was something like four coups, and certainly in my early years in Ecuador, there were coups as well. That was my first post in 1974. So one of the messages of the American military is you need to stay out of politics.
Yeah.
And that's a hugely important message that I think was very successful in Latin America. And I'll never forget one day, I hadn't been in El Salvador very long. The brother of the chief of staff of the El Salvador Army gets up and talks about his experiences in West Point and how that conveyed to him American values. And the other thing and Wes Clark was the commander of Southcom.
General Clark, yeah.
Most of the time I was there. They taught him how to do things that were needed in a more modern environment, like interdiction of drugs, like patrolling the rivers for contraband, like doing disaster relief, which was critically important in a country like El Salvador,
absolutely,
which was plagued by earthquakes. So the American military was very active in this. And most people who work on civil-military relations in El Salvador talk about the experience when the Salvadoran troops went to Iraq.
Oh, yeah.
And they were there for quite some time, I think 5 or 6 years. They were part of the multinational force, and they were both, if I might say, professional and courageous, and a very positive partner. And that's what years of good U.S. training. Again, certainly not without controversy in the early days, but the Iraq experience, I think, was a positive one for all concerned.
I'm glad you brought that up. I had some experience with a NATO training mission in Iraq, and it completely escaped me that the El Salvadorans were there in so many small countries. I remember, one of the greatest sets of security guards were the Togolese from Togo.
Yeah.
Let's move on. So after El Salvador, you proceeded to Colombia as ambassador from 2000 to 2003. The U.S. was a big broker in Planned Colombia to get control over illegal narcotics and the FARC, very ruthless Colombian paramilitary group trying to overthrow the government. I believe, and we talked earlier, that there was a potential attempt on your life. It was a bomb. Not exactly sure who it was intended for, but you powered right through that. And I was in Colombia after you left. And again, traveling with Admiral Mullen, we went down to see President Uribe. I'm sure you ran into him. They called him El Jefe. And I remember, I think his father was killed by the FARC. He was a farmer, a gentleman farmer. And we also met Defense Minister Santos, who later became president, and all the Colombian Joint Chiefs, one of whom, interestingly enough, Admiral Barrera, who's still a great friend, was their CNO and is now an adjunct professor at the Naval War College in Newport, and he's an American now. So this must have been an even more challenging assignment than the last one. Can you enlighten us what it was like to be in Colombia at this tumultuous time and your relationship with Southcom from Colombia and your relationship with your military attaches who were involved in Plan Colombia, counter-drug, and also probably advising Colombian armed forces on the FARC?
Well, it wasn't much of an assassination attempt because it was a roadside bomb, but it was I was with Senator Wellstone at the time. But the real issue in Colombia was just an extraordinary high degree of violence. For instance, our aid mission was in a commercial building, and one morning the baker in the neighborhood discovered, because it was unusual, a car bomb. So we had to move the aid mission, and there was a bomb in the DEA building, and we were never entirely sure who the violence was aimed at. But in one case, we thought it was a labor dispute, just a high degree of violence, and it was with a history of really extraordinary violence. But when I was there, we had embarked on this plan called Plan Colombia because Colombia was on the verge of being a failed state.
Yeah, I remember that.
And when I was there, it was not just the narcotics, it was a raging insurgency. And basically, the government had lost control of almost everything except the major cities. So we had a program that involved spraying cocoa crops. It involved $1 billion in assistance. It involved training Colombian special forces. It involved assistance. And I heard Secretary Gates at one point said this was one of the most successful foreign policy programs that he had ever seen. And I want to talk about this for a minute because to me it was an extraordinary example of civil-military cooperation.
Great.
And I want to talk about the two leaders who did this. And that was General Barry McCaffrey and Undersecretary Tom Pickering. And they were put in charge of this program. And these two leaders, General McCaffrey, who, by the way, his father, also General McCaffrey, had led Colombian troops during the Korean War.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, he was then drug czar. But General McCaffrey had a lot of prestige and a lot of, well, anyone who knows him, he's a demanding boss, I think would be fair to say. He could reach into the Pentagon and fix things, like with a phone call. Both of them were very prestigious and very well respected on the Hill, so that gave us a lot of money, and it gave us a lot of congressional support. But they wouldn't tolerate a lot of nonsense in the interagency. And if you didn't play ball, you were no longer employed on Colombia. So there was a great unity, as you all put it, of chain of command.
Yeah.
And then they hired people that were not only competent, but also amiable and worked together in a very satisfactory fashion. So when I was at Yale a couple of years ago, I taught a course in Afghanistan, and I was just blown away, frankly, by the contrast between the two basic forms of Washington leadership that evolved over time, because it was the McCaffrey-Pickering duo and their ability to work together and their ability to mobilize the interagency, and not to underestimate the role of the Colombians, because President Uribe was elected when I was there, and he was a good partner in all of this. And the drop in violence over 3 years was dramatic.
Yeah.
The year I got there, there were 3,200 kidnappings, and
Wow.
I went back 5 years later, and I went to call on Uribe, and it was sometime in the spring, and he said, no, there have been 3 that year so far, and that just blew me away. Because the restoration of security was a big success. And then, of course, the economy recovered. Colombians began to bring their resources back to the country. But I really ascribe a lot of this to the leadership of Barry McCaffrey and Tom Pickering.
2 great American icons, and I've met General McCaffrey before, but not many times. I know he's extremely active still with the West Point Association of Old Grads and support for the military academy. My son's a graduate of West Point. And, of course, Ambassador Pickering here in town through the American Academy of Diplomacy. But just two incredible Americans that did great work alongside you. And I didn't realize that Uribe was elected at that time when you were down there.
And that made a huge difference, because he began to focus on the restoration of security. He got the police back in the villages.
Yeah.
And by then, I think our training of the military units was beginning to really bear results.
When I was down there with Admiral Mullen and we spent time with the president, we had dinner with Defense Minister Santos. Then the president saw us, and then there was a trip to each one of the service chiefs, to the Chad and the Chief of the Army, Chief of the Air Force, and Chief of the Navy, Admiral Barrera. And each time that Admiral Mullen went in, one of the chiefs would have a phone behind his desk, and in the middle of this meeting, the phone would ring, and they'd look back, and it was Uribe.
I remember that.
He was calling to remind them of something,
And I remember when not that long after Uribe was elected, I went to see the chief of police, the national chief of police. And the same phenomenon there. Uribe calls him in, maybe even twice during the meeting, to tell him to do something.
Yeah.
So it mobilized the bureaucracy. Not that Colombians were finally realized the serious problems they have, but he was the catalyst for a lot of change.
Yeah. Well, he certainly did well by his country, and of course, then Minister Santos came in. Had a more progressive outlook, and thankfully, cross our fingers. I mean, things are always tenuous, but so far so good in Colombia. And thanks to your leadership, man. Okay, another tough one here. Next overseas post was as ambassador to Pakistan. That's where I first met you in 2007 with Admiral Mullen. And of course, after the Marriott bombing, you didn't want us to stay out in town. Admiral Mullen's mission was to restore contact and relationships with the Pakistani military because we had been set back by the Pressler Amendment after the coup, and that forbade contact mill to mill between the United States and the Pakistani military. So it was a daunting task. I mean, we had to go out in Islamabad, and we had to get around the country, but you always met us and invited us to stay in your residence, which I recall fondly as one of the most beautiful Frank Lloyd Wright houses that I had the privilege of staying in. And so, Admiral Mullen wanted to see Musharraf. He wanted to see Kiani. He wanted to see the ISI chief, the Chad, the service chiefs. And you had dealings with all of them. President or Prime Minister Musharraf used to wear a uniform. He was formerly in charge of the military. It took a long time to get him out of, I think they called it the White House, right? And let General Kiani move in as Chad. Admiral Mullen recognized how important this was, and he picked one of the finest naval officers to go to Islamabad and to work with you as the senior defense attaché in the Office of Defense Cooperation Chief, and that was Vice Admiral Mike Lefevre. He started out, I think, as a 1-star and got a 2nd and 3rd star while he was there because he was there so long, independently deployed by himself. We even one time took General Kiani out on an aircraft carrier, and that was, Admiral Mullen's direction, plan this, and I want nobody to know about it. It was hard because we had General Petraeus join us from CENTCOM, Admiral Olson from SOCOM, and the point in having them with us was to show General Kiani, hey, we got your back, There's a real tough fight going on in the Hindu Kush between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We want you guys to stay out of it. We'll keep border security, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these missions extremely important. You were right in the middle of it. And I remember you went with us to all these events, and you sat down and you assisted with diplomatic advice and even military advice because you'd been in the country and you knew what was going on. So can you tell us a little bit about the value of mill-to-mill in Pakistan at that time, and then we'll get to the elephant in the room, which is Osama bin Laden later on.
So when I was there, it was 2007 to 2010. It was the height of the war on terror. We had 130,000 troops across the border.
Wow! Yeah, I forgot about that. Yes. You're right.
And of course there were two issues that came up repeatedly with the Pakistanis. One was protection of the 130,000 troops across the border, so the Taliban couldn't establish a safe haven within Pakistan. And two was sort of the indigenous terrorist movement within Pakistan. So it was what happened in Pakistan and our relations with the Pakistan military were really an issue of national importance. Let me say that Admiral Mike Lefevre and General Nagata, who headed our Special Forces unit, were among the most professional military officers I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And Admiral Lefevre had been in Pakistan before when he led earthquake relief. So he was a hero and very well respected within Pakistan, which I'm sure was a factor to
they all knew him.
They all knew him, and he was a great guy. He was absolutely unflappable. Not only being a great military officer, but a great personality. Just relax, he'd say when things came up. And he worked hard, and Admiral Mullen worked hard, and I think we all worked hard to develop relations with the Pakistani military because, let's be frank, they were basically the most important players in the country at this point. Because Admiral Mullen realized, as did Mike Lefevre, that these are basically relationship-based societies, and you can't really move the ball unless you have relationships with your counterparts. Now, did we move the ball? I think on some issues. There were captures and takedowns of major terrorists. There were some progress, I think, on actually restoring some semblance of democratic rule, but I'll admit that was a less than higher priority. Where we failed, I think, was in persuading the Pakistani military to go after the Haqqani network. Mm-hmm. And this was greatly aggravated by the fact that they would not play straight with us. But they did tell us repeatedly that they were afraid that we would depart Pakistan precipitously and leave a mess on their doorstep. General Mackenzie mentioned some of this in his book, too, and unfortunately there was an element of truth to that. So civil-military relations were hugely important. We had a very successful Special Forces unit that aided the Pakistan military in the north of the country that was going great guns until something happened after I left. So there were some successes. Generally speaking, it was a huge mistake to cut off the Pakistan military from American training all those years. Because you walk into General Kayani's house, and the first thing you saw in his house was a picture of his class at Leavenworth.
Right.
And one time I went to see him, and he started to talk. It was the two of us about his experience in Leavenworth, and mostly he talked about this older lady in the community who had been assigned to their family, and she had helped his wife out when she was pregnant, and he'd invited her to Pakistan many times.
Is that right?
So you can't put a price on that kind of relationship. So it was hard, and now I think we've regressed somewhat
Yeah.
vis-a-vis Pakistan, and we need to do everything we can to not just reestablish relations with the military, but also reestablish relations with the country as a whole, because we can't just, if I might say so, just turn the country over to the Chinese.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more, ma'am. And, it was a surprise, I think, to all of us in May 2012 with the determination that Osama bin Laden was in Abbottabad. And I'm certain that in all the helicopter flights Admiral Mullen and I took around that country, because we went over to see the Air Force chief, we went to the Torkham Gate, flew over the Khyber Pass in a Mi-17, which was a real experience.
Mm.
And, back to Islamabad and flew over Abbottabad. Their military academy, their version of West Point, is just a couple of miles away. And so it was extremely disappointing after all that work to come to that kind of an end state in the relationship. And I know we were set back, but Pakistani military is very active here in Washington. They attend many of our international events here at the Navy League, and it's my hope that we can put the relationship back on track because, as you pointed out, there are other great powers out there besides the United States who would like to capitalize on that.
Now.
Yep. Okay, moving on to the last of your ambassadorial posts, and not the least, and of course, not the most, not even we haven't even got to the challenges of Egypt, but you were U.S. ambassador to Egypt from 2011 to 2013 in the midst of the Arab Spring. And this was the most difficult time for U.S. and Egyptian relationships, as President Hosni Mubarak was displaced by President Mohamed Morsi. That was an election that was legitimate. He was later overthrown by President El-Sisi, who's been in charge ever since. Ironically, once again, we didn't see each other, but I was right next door because we were involved from Naples, Italy, Sixth Fleet, Naval Forces Europe, as the head of the Joint Task Force Odyssey Dawn for Libya. And that was an AFRICOM-run task force for the first couple of months, and then shifted to NATO. So General Carter Ham, and then shifted to NATO under Jim Stavridis, who delegated those authorities back to Naval Forces Europe and Africa. So 9 long months. The operation began with humanitarian assistance in the airlift of Egyptian third country nationals from Jerba, Tunisia. So these Egyptians have been in Libya working, and when the environment was unsustainable, they came out. Right. And they went either through Benghazi to Egypt, or they went the other way to Jerba. And here they are in Jerba, and it was President Obama who said, look, let's get these folks back to Cairo. And so we had 4 Marine Corps C-130s, refueling aircraft for the MV-22s, and we loaded them up, and probably 1,000 people were transferred during that period of time. And it was very shortly thereafter that this engagement turned kinetic. We did a NEO, a non-combatant evacuation operation, got Americans out, and then for the rest of 9 months, established a no-fly zone and tried to reduce the violence of Gaddafi's forces, particularly his son Hamis in the 32nd Brigade against innocent people in Benghazi and the Government of National Accord, which was the opposition that opposed him. So pretty tough time for you in Egypt. And you were there until 2013. Sadly, the special envoy in Libya, who later became the ambassador, somebody that, while military forces were there, while we were there with Odyssey Dawn Unified Protector, we protected Chris Stevens from the sea. We had a plan to get him out. He was in Benghazi. He was really courageous. And then we raised the flag on the American embassy in Tripoli. Those military forces moved away. His protection devolved to diplomatic security. And then I'll never forget it, 9/11/2012, he was killed by a terrorist raid on the American embassy compound in Benghazi, and a major setback for all of us. So how did this impact you in Egypt? And with all this going on in the Arab Spring, Odyssey Dawn in Libya, it made the importance of military forces affiliated with the embassy that much more important. And I'm sure President El-Sisi admired the fact that, we had continued relationships with him lots of exercises, Bright Star going on in Egypt, the defense of the Sinai against nefarious elements. But any particular anecdotes come to mind from this period of time in your life?
Well, I think the death of Ambassador Chris Stevens and the aftermath of Benghazi had a huge effect on our relations throughout the region. As you might recall, it was in response to the burning of a Quran somewhere in Florida. And actually, the embassy in Cairo was less affected by that than many other in the region. And I think it was less affected because some of my staff, I was watching my son graduate from Quantico at that time, but it was.
Oh, he's a Marine.
He was a Marine.
Was a Marine.
Yes, he
Former Marine. Yeah.
And so my staff went out and reached out to Islamic groups, which they know, and they never attacked the embassy. So it was relatively, the attacks, frankly, at the Cairo embassy were quite minor. And then honestly, the Egyptians have a very serious army and a very serious police force, and they're not about to let anything happen to the American embassy. This is not Yemen or Libya or even Tunis. It's a country with long-standing institutions. But we did evacuate some people. And at the time, I thought it was a overreaction. I talked to Lloyd Austin probably and other people at CENTCOM a couple times a week. He had teams down there working on how to evacuate us. We talked to them a lot. We knew exactly what the plan was. But I think what you do need to do in situations like that is send home the dependents.
Right.
Because what happens is there are certainly a lot of employees, but almost universally a lot of dependents who haven't been in that situation before, and they tend to get very anxious. The other complication in Egypt was it was just a constant stage of unrest. There were riots like clockwork twice a week. I remember one night my son, between his Marine courses, was staying with us, and I told him to stay on the other side of the river because they were shooting around our house. So that sort of makes people nervous.
Yeah, of course.
So dependents mostly went home after and that's a cost because you can't attract people, and then the employees often want to go home too. But I met, according to General Al-Sisi, I met with him personally 32 times.
Wow.
That sounds like a lot to me.
It does,
but
yeah.
I did meet with him a lot, and I felt like I got to know him. General Langell was chief of our military unit. Of course, he became head of the National Guard unit later. Yeah. So we had absolutely first-string military support. And we had, I think, quite good civil-military relations. General Mattis came a number of times. General Dempsey came also frequently. So I think we were in a position to influence the military in Egypt in a reasonable way. It was important to keep those contacts viable, not the least of which was security in the Sinai and the security of Israel.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up CENTCOM because, of course, CENTCOM, the Unified Command Plan, has oversight and responsibility for American interests in Egypt, whereas the rest of the continent of Africa is apportioned to AFRICOM. And then, of course, there's EUCOM in there. We're doing this combat operation in Libya. And the one thing that I was impressed with is there was seamless integration between the combatant commanders, whether it was AFRICOM, EUCOM, or CENTCOM. We all worked together. It's almost like there were no lines, but those lines exist for a reason. And, it complicates things sometimes, but frankly, when you get military people together and it's a collaborative group, it goes very smoothly. You mentioned the evacuation of non-essential personnel and some of the dependents. I wonder if you might comment. You've been an ambassador 4 times. You've been in countries that have had really, really tough situations. So, the calculus of an ambassador to actually commit to a non-combatant evacuation operation, that means you're going to as I think we say in diplomatic terms, shuttered the embassy. People are going to leave. Locally based employees will stay. But I've always heard from ambassadors that the biggest problem with that is once you go, it's really hard to get back in.
It's almost impossible to get back in. And I think the fallout, the political fallout from Benghazi has worsened that considerably. We left Yemen and we left Libya about 10 years ago. Now we've left Sudan.
Right.
Off and on, we pulled out of places like Basra and Iraq. And the problem is the security to go back in is never good enough that people are going to sign off. But the costs are very considerable on this because when you're not there, you're not in a position to influence the host government. You often don't know what's going on, and that has a cost internationally. And frankly, I think often in these cases, we just flat look weak because once you effectively turn tail and run, other countries follow the Americans right out the door.
Right.
And so you lose not only the American presence, but you lose sort of an allied presence too that can be your ears and eyes on the ground. But security is a really important element, and that's what ambassadors have to evaluate. Again, in Egypt, fundamentally, I wasn't all that concerned. You could certainly have had an incident, but again, a very serious police and military presence. So can you get security? Can you get it from offshore, as you described in Libya? Can you get it from militia groups? We've done that before.
Yeah, you do what you got to do, right?
Yeah, you got to do it. Washington always gets nervous about that, but that's happened before where you get the cooperation of a militia group. So you have to make the evaluation of can you keep your people safe. And when I was the Assistant Secretary for the Middle East, we evacuated both Yemen and Libya. And it was nerve-wracking to get all those people out, either through a third country like Oman in the case of Yemen, or in Libya where they had to get U.S. military cover to move to the coast to get out.
Yeah, I remember that. It was there was much discussion about the NEO in Libya because for a number of reasons, we decided not to put a warship inside the pier in Tripoli, Libya. We put a cruise ship in there and loaded up the cruise ship. And it took days to find everybody and get them on this cruise ship. But we finally had a full muster and got those folks out under military escort. Some believed that we should have gone in there full bore, but nobody wanted to exacerbate the situation any more than it was. So it's probably the right move.
Evacuating American citizens is extremely complicated, as we saw in Afghanistan, because they have no obligation and often don't make their presence known to the embassy. And in many of these countries, in Yemen, there were something like 30,000 dual citizens
right,
who are, of course, eligible for evacuation if they choose to take advantage of it. But you often don't know where they are and who they are.
Yeah, and it's a problem because when things get really bad, somebody will pop up and say, "Here I am, come and get me," and it's very, very difficult. You mentioned Sudan. I've written about this. I don't want to be too hard on the military, but the violence took place. It got very bad. We made a decision to get Americans out. We flew helicopters in from the coast, but they didn't come from an expeditionary strike group. It didn't come from our Marines on amphibious forces. We did not have at the time an expeditionary strike group because of issues with maintenance and inventory. And so we did it with a joint high-speed vessel and some helos. But the preponderance of those dual citizens or Americans that were not taken out on the first tranche of the embassy had to drive 500 miles from Khartoum to Port Sudan, get on the expeditionary patrol frigate and cross into Jeddah, Saudi Arabia to be lifted out on commercial airlines. That's unacceptable. How do you fix it? Got to have more ships, more Marines, more sailors doing this mission. I firmly believe in the value of an expeditionary strike group, and I was happy to see that we got a block buy of 6 of these amphib ships. It'll take us a while to get there, but they have not lost their utility. Ma'am, you're an incredible diplomat. Some of the stories you've told here today have just been remarkable. You took and accepted the hard jobs. You broke the glass ceiling in becoming a woman ambassador in some of the toughest regions of the world. And I just wonder, for our audience, what is your advice to aspiring female leaders in the Department of State or in the Navy? And we now have our first female Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti. We worked together over at Naval Forces Europe. She was 6th Fleet Commander, and I was the commander of NavEur. And so I think we're starting to see gender equality take hold here for the better. And we have a female commander of the Coast Guard. So
a couple of months ago, the chairman invited me and a number of other civilians to go to one of their meetings. And I was sitting behind General Laura Richardson.
Southcom,
and there was a woman who had Transcom. I can't remember. And then Admiral Franchetti and
Jackie Van Ovis.
That was her name. And I thought, man, how times have changed, and they've changed everywhere. I mean, in fairness, the real breakthrough year at the State Department was, I came in 1973. That was the very year that they said married women didn't have to resign. So to show you how times have changed. And then in 1990, Secretary Jim Baker came in. And he asked for a list of the deputy assistant secretaries, which is sort of middle management in the State Department. And either there was one woman or 0 women on that list. And he said, okay, enough. There has to be a woman in every bureau. And that not only gave women the jobs for which I think they had deserved, but it also showed that women could operate across an entire range of activities. And I'm sure the same was true in the military, and also I think in CIA and our intelligence agencies. So the advice I give is that the first thing I say is these national security jobs are hard.
Right.
And like any profession, I'm sure that the military is no different than state. There's some jobs that you have to have as you move up the ladder. And those are the most demanding. For instance, if you're an assistant to General Eric Carilla now, you're not getting your weekends off. You're working around the clock.
That's a fact.
And there's no way around that. So you have to manage your career, particularly if you have family responsibilities, to account for that. And that's hard. But I do think there's been a big breakthrough, certainly in most levels. At the State Department, at least, women are still only 25% of senior positions. But still, there's room for improvement. My son, who's a Marine, told me in 2016, I said, well, they're going to say that women are allowed in Marine combat units. And he says to me, my son is, I think, a liberal sort of guy, He says to me, no, General Dunford's going to take care of that for us. And I said, I don't think so, So I still think, maybe in the working level, so-called working level, there probably still room for better integration of females.
Absolutely. Well, the good news is we're making progress. And did you say in 1973, if you got married at the State Department, you had to resign?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
No.
I had no idea.
No, I can't tell you how times have changed. And
yeah.
The big breakthrough sort of culturally, if you married another, the big breakthrough.
Another FSO?
Yeah, if you married, and that was mostly what people married, of course.
Right.
Because those were the men who were around. But I think the big cultural breakthrough came in the 80s for lots of reasons. I think that was true in the broader society too. But the real jump into senior positions came with Secretary Eagleburger and Secretary Baker.
Wow. Yeah, I remember hearing Secretary Baker speak at the U.S. Institute of Peace last year, and he was 96 years old. And
he still was just as coherent as
unbelievable. Yeah.
Amazing. So, it was, but it's, it's a struggle. And one of the areas I think state has struggled with is some minority women. They have not risen as fast. Diversity. But I think the society as a whole has that issue too. So in that respect, we're a reflection of the broader society.
Well, we will hope that we continue to drive forward on both gender equality and diversity. So, folks, that's a wrap. Thank you, Ambassador Anne Patterson, for joining Maritime Nation. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. And if you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks to Dataminr for the sponsorship and support. And thank you to our CIO, Ms. Jolene Edwards, for producing this podcast today. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation in November.